I still remember the way the ballroom smelled that night, like money and white flowers and somebody else's dream. I was at the very back, at one of those round tables near the kitchen doors where the servers kept bursting through with trays and apologies. Table 14, the leftover table. Every time the doors swung open, a blast of cold air and the clatter of dishes rushed past my shoulder, like a reminder that I was exactly where I belonged in this family, close enough to be useful, far enough to be invisible. Up front, under chandeliers that looked like frozen stars, my sister Lauren was glowing in lace and satin. The photographer followed her every move, catching her laughter, her bouquet, the way her new husband leaned in like she was the center of the universe. I watched from my little island by the kitchen and tried to convince myself I was happy for her and not just painfully aware that I had once planned a very different life for myself. I was 29 years old, a pediatric nurse, and a single mom who had forgotten what it felt like to sit down without calculating the cost of getting back up. I kept smoothing the skirt of the dress I'd bought off a sale rack 2 years earlier, hoping nobody would notice the slightly frayed hem. My feet hurt in heels I couldn't afford to replace. My phone sat face down on the table next to my untouched champagne flute, because I knew if I saw a picture of my daughter right then, I might cry and not stop. Ava had wanted to come. She's 5, and in her mind, every event is an excuse to wear a princess dress. We'd found one in a thrift store, deep burgundy tulle with a crooked hem, and she'd twirled around the living room in it until she fell over. She had asked me with those big, hopeful eyes if she could see Aunt Lauren become a bride. I'd told her no, that it would be boring for kids, and there would be too many grown-ups and not enough cartoons. The truth was, I didn't want her stuck under the microscope with me. It felt kinder to leave her at home with Chloe, watching movies and eating popcorn, than to drag her into a room full of people who still treated her existence like a stain on my resume. My mother found me during the cocktail hour, gliding over in a dress that probably cost more than my rent. She didn't sit. She never really landed anywhere. She just hovered by my chair with her wine glass, eyes already scanning the room for the next conversation that mattered. She said she had been wondering why I came alone, as if my entire life hadn't been one long demonstration of that fact. She mentioned, in that soft little voice she uses when she wants to sound kind while cutting you open, that there were some very successful men here tonight. She wondered aloud why I didn't at least try. My father stood behind her with his hands in his pockets, doing that thing where he looked like he wished he were anywhere else. He added a half-hearted comment about hoping I was doing okay at work, the way people ask about the weather. When I said I had left Ava with Chloe, my mom's mouth tightened just a little. She called Ava the baby in a tone that made it clear she still didn't think my child belonged in the same category as the rest of the family's grandchildren, the planned ones with matching nurseries and college funds. They drifted away before I could say much. They had more interesting people to circle. Lauren and her new husband, my cousins with their graduate degrees, the aunts whose children were currently cataloging their second homes. I sat back, listened to the buzz of conversation about hedge funds and ski trips, and tried to pretend I didn't hear my own name sprinkled in here and there, followed by that sympathetic little sigh people reserve for car accidents and bad haircuts. And then there was Ryan. He looked like a magazine ad for the life I was supposed to have. Tailored navy suit, easy grin, glass of whiskey in his hand, one arm around my cousin Madison's shoulders like she was a prize he'd won. Madison was visibly pregnant, her dress designed to show it off tastefully. The family couldn't stop touching her stomach, asking about due dates, and cooing over baby names. Every hand that landed on that bump was a reminder that when I had shown them my own positive pregnancy test years earlier, the room had gone silent and stayed that way. Ryan had been my husband once. Back when I was in med school, we thought we were going to take over the world together. Back before a little pink line turned everything into a multiple-choice question. I didn't know how to answer. His solution had been simple. He insisted he wasn't ready to be a father, said he needed time, said he couldn't breathe. A month later, he moved out. 6 months after that, he married my cousin Madison at a country club wedding that my parents attended, and I did not. I tried not to watch him now, but my eyes kept finding him in the crowd. The way he laughed a little too loudly at jokes. He made sure to kiss Madison's forehead where everyone could see. It was funny, in a sick kind of way. He had told me back then that he wasn't ready for a family. Apparently, he just hadn't been ready for one with me. Dinner felt like a marathon I hadn't trained for. Course after course arrived at our table, pretty and perfect, while I picked at each one and listened to the conversations around me. The couple on my left discussed their new place in the Hamptons like it was a minor purchase, the way I talk about buying a different brand of cereal. Across from me, A woman flashed an engagement ring that probably equaled my annual salary. I smiled when people looked my way, because it's amazing how good you get at smiling when the alternative is screaming. I was thinking about leaving early when I saw movement at the edge of the dance floor. Ryan peeled away from Madison as the DJ shifted into a slow song. He glanced at his wife, then at me, and started in my direction. There is a particular dread that settles in your stomach when you see someone walking toward you, and you already know the conversation will cost more than you can afford. That's what I felt as he stopped at my table. He asked how I had been in that casual tone you use when bumping into an old coworker at the grocery store. He hinted that we should be adults about everything now. He mentioned that Madison's baby was due soon, his legitimate child, and he let those words hang between us like a verdict. He never said the word mistake out loud, but I heard it in every pause. The mistake that derailed my med school path. The mistake that turned into Ava and into the version of me everyone in this room liked to trot out as a cautionary tale. He smiled after he said it, as if he hadn't just taken a knife to my ribcage. I froze. In my head, I imagined myself standing up, knocking over my chair, saying all the things I never said to him when he packed his bags and walked out. In reality, my tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth. I watched him walk away, back to Madison, who was watching us with a hand on her rounded belly and an expression that said she had already won whatever game she thought we were playing. The song changed to something even slower. Couples drifted onto the dance floor, swaying under chandeliers that made everything look softer than it was. My parents joined hands and moved in, that careful way long-married people do. Lauren and her husband spun in the center, faces lit by flash after flash from the photographer's camera. Even my younger cousins paired off, laughing, tipsy, golden in the warm light. I sank deeper into my chair at table 14 and stared at the linen napkin in my lap, trying to focus on counting the stitches rather than on the sting behind my eyes. I thought about Ava at home in her pajamas, probably halfway through a cartoon movie with Chloe, sticky fingers from microwave popcorn. I wondered how I would explain this night to her one day, if I ever would. How do you tell a child that some people will always measure her worth by the wrong things? I was on the verge of slipping away, imagining myself texting Lauren a quick apology from the back of a cab. When I felt it, that prickling awareness along the back of my neck, the sense of being watched, I looked up toward the bar. He was standing apart from the crowd, but somehow he still owned the room. Tall, broad shoulders filling out a dark suit that was cut too perfectly to be off the rack. Dark hair, trimmed close at the sides. From where I sat, I could see the line of his jaw, sharp and unyielding, and the way the overhead light caught on the planes of his face. His tie was loosened just enough to suggest comfort, not sloppiness. If I had seen him on the street, I might have assumed he was some high-powered attorney or hedge fund guy. But there was something about the way people avoided bumping into him, the space that opened around him without him asking, that felt different. More than anything, it was his eyes. Even from across the ballroom, I could feel them on me. He wasn't glancing in my direction the way people do when they happen to look around. He was studying me, not in a creepy way, but with a focused, almost clinical curiosity, like he was watching a scene in a play and trying to figure out what my role was. I did what I always do when attention finds me. I looked away. My cheeks burned. I reached for my water glass just to have something to do with my hands. When I risked another glance, I saw him talking to one of the groom's relatives, I thought. And then, slowly, he started walking across the room. Have you ever had one of those moments where it feels like the entire world narrows down to a single path, and you can see someone moving along it straight toward you? That's what it felt like. The music blurred into the background. The laughter, the clinking glasses, the clatter of plates behind me, all of it faded. It was just him, closing the distance between the bar and my forgotten table by the kitchen doors. He didn't ask if the seat next to me was taken. He simply took it, like someone used to making decisions and assuming people would adjust. Up close, he looked even more imposing. Light brown eyes, almost amber, took in everything about me with one slow sweep. The old dress, the tired face, the empty chair beside mine, the way my shoulders were hunched like I was trying to fold myself into something smaller. He introduced himself as Adrian Romano. He mentioned, almost in passing, that he was a business associate of someone in the groom's family, that he owned restaurants in the city. His voice was calm, smooth, with the slightest hint of an accent that made his words feel heavier somehow. He said he had been watching me all evening, that he could tell I was doing my best to disappear. He said it like an observation, not an accusation. I felt exposed and weirdly seen at the same time. It is disorienting when a stranger you've never met reads you more accurately in 2 minutes than your own family has in years. He pointed out that I had come alone, that the man who had approached me earlier had left me looking like I wanted to be anywhere else. He noticed that I kept checking my phone, that I had the sort of posture people get when they are braced for impact. Then he did something even stranger. He told me he had a proposition. He explained, in that same measured tone, that his own relatives were relentless about his personal life, that they wanted him to settle down, that they were watching him tonight just as closely as my family was watching me. What if, he suggested, we gave them something to see? What if, just for the rest of the evening, we pretended to be together, his wife, his partner, his something, and let the room draw its own conclusions? On paper, it sounded insane. I was a single mom in a thrift store dress. He looked like he had a driver waiting outside with the engine running. Everything in my life had taught me to be careful around men like him. Powerful, self-assured, carrying the kind of quiet danger that hums beneath the surface. And yet there was something in his eyes that didn't feel predatory. It felt intentional, like he had decided I was worth stepping in for. He stood and held out his hand, palm open, as the next song began. He didn't pressure. Not really. He just waited. Behind him, on the other side of the dance floor, I could see Ryan watching us with a look that was half confusion, half something darker. My mother had gone still at her table, eyes locked on the man in the dark suit standing in front of her. Disappointed daughter. The sensible thing would have been to smile politely, to decline, to ride out the rest of the night at table 14, and go home to my tiny apartment and my sleeping child and the small life I had learned to carry. Instead, I looked at Adrian's hand, at the silver cufflink catching the light at his wrist, and felt something in me tip. I reached out and took his hand. In that moment, standing up from the leftover table by the kitchen, I had no idea that a simple yes to a fake dance would turn into the kind of story you only whisper about. All I knew was that for the first time in a long time, I was not going to walk out of that room alone. When Adrian led me onto the dance floor, it felt like stepping through an invisible curtain. 1 second, I was the girl tucked by the kitchen doors. The next, I was in the center of the room under a spill of golden light, with every crystal on those chandeliers glittering above my head like it had been hanging there just for this moment. His hand settled at the small of my back, warm through the thin fabric of my dress. His other hand closed around mine, firm and steady in a way that made it very clear he was used to leading. I remember being absurdly grateful that my palms weren't sweating, at least not yet. My heart, on the other hand, had decided to sprint. I don't even remember what song was playing. Something slow, pretty, the kind of track wedding DJs use when they want couples to sway automatically. What I remember is the feeling of my body trying to decide whether it was allowed to relax into him or whether it needed to stay on high alert. My muscles had been clenched all night from the moment I walked into the ballroom alone, and suddenly there was this anchor, this solid wall of heat and tailored fabric, guiding me through the crowd as if I belonged there. He moved in that effortless way people do when they've had lessons, when they grew up being told they should know how to waltz through a room, not just walk across it. Every time he shifted his weight, my body followed almost on instinct. It took only a few steps for me to realize that all I really needed to do was trust that he wouldn't let me fall, which was ironic, because trusting strangers was not exactly a skill I possessed. I could feel eyes on us. At first, it was just a general awareness, the way you notice when the energy in a room shifts. Then I started to pick out specific faces. My mother, sitting ramrod straight, her expression frozen between suspicion and delight. My father, eyebrows lifted, quietly recalculating whatever story he thought he knew about my life. My cousins were whispering behind their hands, trying to pretend they weren't. And then there was Ryan. He stood near the bar with a glass in his hand, staring at us like he'd forgotten how to blink. I watched the moment he realized this wasn't some polite pity dance with a random guest. This was something else. This man, whom he didn't recognize, was holding me close enough that my dress brushed his trousers when we turned. I saw the confusion first, then irritation flickering underneath. I would be lying if I said that I didn't feel at least a little bit satisfied. Adrian leaned his head slightly closer as we moved, not so close that it felt intimate to anyone watching, but close enough that I could hear him over the music without him raising his voice. He started talking in that low, even tone, laying out the bones of the story he wanted the room to believe. He suggested that we had met at the hospital where I worked. He painted it in simple strokes. His business partner's child had been a patient on my ward. There had been some kind of complication, and I had kept my head when everyone else was panicking. In his version, he had been impressed by how calm and capable I was, had found a way to thank me later. And from there, things progressed very slowly, because I was careful and private. He said this as he had already rehearsed it, though I knew he hadn't. He was building the lie in real time, placing pieces carefully where he knew they would hold. I listened, half dancing, half performing, my mind cataloging each detail. I noticed how he made sure I came off as strong and self-contained, not some desperate woman clinging to a rich man's sleeve. He emphasized that I worked long shifts, that I had obligations outside of him. It was such a small thing, but it made my chest tighten. Even in the middle of this ridiculous charade, he was protecting my dignity. There were moments when he fell quiet and just moved with me, his attention split between keeping us in sync and scanning the room like he was tracking a dozen different currents at once. People parted for us without him asking. No one dared bump into him, the way strangers do when a floor is crowded. It was like the space rearranged itself to make room wherever he went. After the song ended, he did not drop my hand. He kept it in his, guiding me off the dance floor toward one of the high-top tables closer to the center of the room instead of back to my lonely little station by the kitchen. I felt exposed there, under brighter light, with fewer table numbers to hide behind. That, of course, was when the first relative swooped in. My cousin, one of the friendlier vultures, approached with an expression that was half greeting, half interrogation. She wrapped me in a hug that smelled like expensive perfume and curiosity, then turned her attention to Adrian with that measuring look women get when they're trying to determine the make and model of a man on sight. I watched him switch gears smoothly. He told her, in that same calm delivery, that we had been seeing each other quietly for a few months. He said I valued my privacy, especially after my divorce, and that we had chosen not to make anything public until we were sure what this was. He dropped little bits of real information seamlessly: my job, Ava's age, the fact that I lived in Queens, and took early trains to make my shifts. It was unnerving how easily the truth settled into the framework of the lie. My cousin's reaction was exactly what he'd predicted. She was shocked, then delighted, then a little bit annoyed that I hadn't confided in her first. She kept glancing between the two of us, recalibrating everything she thought she knew about my life. That became the pattern for the rest of the night. Family members would drift over in twos and threes, asking how long we had been together, where we met, and what he did. Adrian handled each interaction like a pro. To my aunt, he emphasized the hospital angle, praising my work ethic and how I handled pressure. To my father, he mentioned architecture in passing, asking a question that made my dad light up in a way I hadn't seen in years. To my mother, he talked about family, about coming from a big Italian background where loyalty mattered. Through it all, he never contradicted me, never made me look foolish. If I hesitated or stumbled, he picked up the thread, as though we had rehearsed this for weeks. He remembered every small detail I'd let slip while we danced and built it into our supposed history. It should have terrified me, and in a way, it did. Watching him lie so convincingly made it impossible to forget that I didn't really know who he was, or how often he did this sort of thing. But at the same time, it felt like stepping into a version of myself I had almost given up on. For once, I wasn't the cautionary tale in whispers. I wasn't the poor single mom who worked night shifts and lived in up-and-coming neighborhoods. I was the woman standing beside a man everyone else instinctively respected. At one point, I caught sight of my mother watching us from across the room. Her expression had softened into something I didn't quite recognize. Approval, maybe, or relief that her daughter had found someone who looked like he belonged in this world of chandeliers and champagne. My father gave Adrian one of those short, male nods that carries a surprising amount of weight. Lauren, between dances and photos, shot me an amused, slightly bewildered smile, like she was witnessing a plot twist in a show she thought she understood. And then there was Ryan, again and again, standing just close enough that I could feel his stare on the back of my neck. When our eyes met once across the dinner tables, there was no mistaking the anger in his face. He had never looked at me that way when we were married, not even at the end. This was new. A man watching something he had thrown away become something valuable in someone else's hands. The night blurred after a while. There was more dancing, more small talk, more food I barely tasted. Underneath it all, there was this constant hum of tension inside me. Part of me kept waiting for the mask to slip, for Adrian to reveal some flaw or crack that would make it easy to walk away. Instead, he kept doing these small, unexpected things, moving his chair slightly so he could shield me from a draft, making sure my glass was water, not refilled champagne, steering conversations away when relatives pressed too hard about my past. By the time the DJ announced the last song, my feet were throbbing, and my smile muscles ached. Guests started collecting coats, calling for rides. Lauren and her new husband disappeared in a flurry of hugs and goodbye photos. My parents did the blandly affectionate farewell routine. My mother hugged me with one arm. My father patted my shoulder and said he was glad I seemed happy. It was a strange, almost out-of-body experience hearing those words and knowing they were based on a story that hadn't existed 4 hours earlier. Outside, the New York night had turned cold and wet. Rain had slicked the sidewalks and turned every neon reflection on the street into smeared streaks of color. I stepped out onto the curb, expecting to flag a cab or call a rideshare, already calculating how much the trip back to Queens would cost and whether I could stretch what was left in my checking account until payday. Adrian's driver was already waiting, of course. A black SUV idling at the curb like something out of a movie. The back door opened as soon as we approached. Adrian gestured for me to get in, like it was the most natural thing in the world for a man like him to send me home in a car like that. Inside, the city felt far away. The windows were tinted, the leather seats soft and still faintly warm from the last person who sat in them. Streetlights painted faint gold streaks across the interior as we pulled away from the hotel. For the first time all night, it was quiet. No clinking glasses, no distant laughter, no relatives orbiting us. It was in that small silence that he laid out his real proposal. He spoke in that same calm, measured tone he'd used all evening, but there was an honesty threaded through it now that hadn't been there before. He explained that the act we had put on tonight had served both of us better than he'd expected. His family would back off for a while, believing he'd finally chosen someone. My family, at least for the moment, would stop using my singleness as a conversation topic. He suggested we keep it going. Not forever, just for a few weeks. Long enough to give everyone the impression that this was real, that we were heading somewhere serious. I sat there, listening to him outline something that sounded like the plot of a romance novel and the setup to a bad life decision at the same time. He framed it like a business arrangement. Clear terms, mutual benefit, and an end date. No strings. No expectations beyond the performance. But people are not contracts. I knew that better than anyone. I thought about Ava asleep in her little bed in Queens, clutching the stuffed animal Chloe had bought her. I thought about the way my mother's expression had shifted from disappointment to pride just because a man like Adrian had put his hand on my back. I thought about how it had felt to be on that dance floor, not as a joke or a sympathy case, but as someone who belonged to herself first and to this strange, powerful man second. Every lesson I had learned the hard way told me I should say no. Take the ride, say thank you, go back to my small life and my early shifts at the hospital, and all the tiny routines I had built to keep Ava and me afloat. Do not get entangled with a man whose world was obviously more complicated than anything I could see from here. But underneath the fear, there was this thin, sharp thread of longing. For once, I wanted a break from being the one who always figured everything out, who always braced for the next hit alone. He had a card in his hand when the SUV pulled up in front of my building. Simple black. His name embossed in silver. He told me in so many words that there was no pressure, that it was my choice, that if I called, we'd work out the details. If I didn't, he'd consider tonight a one-time favor. When I stepped out into the rain, the reality of my neighborhood hit me in a wave. The cracked sidewalk, the flickering street lamp, and the old woman on the second floor who was always peeking through her curtains. I climbed the stairs with my heels dangling from my fingers, my feet bare and cold, his card like a small weight inside my clutch. Inside the apartment, it was quiet. The only light came from the hallway nightlight Chloe always left on for Ava. I kicked the door shut softly, leaned my back against it, and took the card out. I stood there for a long moment, turning it between my fingers. I told myself I should tear it in half, throw it straight into the trash, wipe this whole evening from my life. I had enough chaos without adding a man like Adrian Romano into the mix. Instead, I slipped the card into my wallet, behind my hospital ID. I went to check on Ava, watched her breathe in the dim glow, tiny lashes resting on her cheeks, completely unaware that anything in her world had shifted. I smoothed her hair, turned out the light, and crawled into my own bed, with the uneasy certainty that the moment I tucked that card away, I had already made a decision I couldn't take back. Adrian picked up on the second ring. I don't even remember what I said exactly. Just fragments. Men at my door, the photo, the name Victor Orlov. What I remember clearly is the way his voice changed. It went from smooth and distant, like a business call, to razor sharp in an instant. He told me to lock every bolt on the door, stay away from the windows, keep my daughter in the bedroom, and not open that door for anyone until I saw him with my own eyes. Then he said he was on his way. The call ended, and the apartment felt even smaller than before. The hum of the fridge, the tick of the cheap clock on the wall, the faint sound of traffic outside it, all pressed in on me. I stood there for a beat, with the phone still in my hand, then moved on, autopilot. I checked Ava again first. She was still out cold, sprawled sideways across her bed, hair a messy halo on the pillow. I sat on the edge of the mattress just long enough to feel her warmth under my hand. She had no idea that two strangers had just used our hallway as a threat, that her mother had just invited a man like Adrian deeper into their lives. Those 15 minutes felt like an hour and like 5 seconds at the same time. I paced from the door to the kitchen and back, straining to hear footsteps in the hallway. Every sound from the building pipes knocking, someone's TV, a toilet flushing upstairs made my heart jump. I checked the peephole twice, even though he'd told me not to open the door. When he finally arrived, I knew it was him before I looked. The knock was firm, but not aggressive. 3 steady raps, a pause, then his voice through the door, low and controlled, saying my name and telling me it was him. I checked the peephole anyway. He stood in the corridor in a dark coat, flanked by 2 men. One was his driver. The other I recognized vaguely from the wedding, a man with dark hair and the kind of watch that says more than an introduction. Later, I'd learn his name was Lucas. I undid the locks with fingers that didn't feel like they belonged to me and let them in. Adrian moved past me as soon as the door opened, eyes scanning the tiny space with the focus of someone trained to catalog threats. It was strange watching a man like him in my little apartment, all sharp lines and expensive fabric against peeling paint and secondhand furniture. Lucas did a quick sweep of the hallway and the rooms, checking the windows, peering through the blinds like he expected those men to materialize right there. The driver stayed just inside the door, blocking it with his body in a way that made me feel safer and more trapped at the same time. I told Adrian everything I could remember. The way they knocked, the phone with the photo, the name Victor Orlov dropped like a test. The implication that I was leveraging was that they knew I mattered to him. As I talked, he listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening a little at certain details. He confirmed, quietly, that it was Orlov's people, a Russian outfit that had been pushing into territories that weren't theirs for a while now. He said they had been looking for angles, soft spots, places to put pressure. Somehow, between that dance floor and my front door, I had become one of those pressure points. What struck me most wasn't that he was connected to men like that. Deep down, I think I'd always known he didn't just own restaurants and wear nice suits. It was that he didn't try to downplay any of it. He didn't lie and tell me I had nothing to worry about. He didn't pat my hand and say it was probably a misunderstanding. He looked me in the eye in my tiny living room and told me straight. My apartment was compromised now, and so was anyone tied to me. That meant Ava. And it meant Chloe. The decision to leave happened faster than my emotions could keep up. Adrian told me we were getting out that night, that he had a secure place on the Upper East Side where he could keep us safe until this was handled. He said Lucas would contact Chloe and bring her in too. He said he wasn't willing to leave open doors for Orlov's people to walk through. Part of me balked at the idea of just abandoning my home in the middle of the night. Another part, bigger, louder, pictured those 2 men standing in the hallway and knew there wasn't actually a choice. Waking Ava was the hardest part. I went into her room and sat on the bed, rubbing her back until she stirred. When she blinked up at me confused, I told her as gently as I could that we were going to sleep somewhere else for a little while. I framed it like an adventure, like a sleepover at a friend's house. Because how do you explain organized crime and death threats to a child who still needs a nightlight? She frowned in that half-awake way, then wrapped her arms around my neck and trusted me, just like that. She didn't even complain when I pulled a hoodie over her pajamas and slid her feet into sneakers. When we walked back into the living room and she saw Adrian, she just tilted her head and said his name like she'd been expecting him, like he was a character in a story she'd heard before and not someone she'd met once in a hotel ballroom. While Lucas coordinated with Chloe on the phone, Adrian helped me pack. It didn't take long. A couple of duffel bags for clothes, a backpack of Ava's favorite toys and schoolwork, my work bag with my ID and stethoscope. Standing there stuffing our lives into cheap canvas, I suddenly noticed how little we actually owned, how replaceable most of it was. The only things that felt sacred were the small ones. The worn stuffed bunny Ava slept with, the photo of her as a newborn in the hospital, the mug Chloe had given me after I passed my nursing boards. When we walked out of the apartment, I locked the door and stood there with the key in my hand, staring at the number stenciled on the metal. I didn't know if we would be back in a week or a month or ever. The hallway smelled like old carpet and someone's dinner. It was the scent of survival, of just getting by. Leaving it behind felt like stepping off a cliff. The SUV ride into Manhattan at that hour was surreal. The city looked different from the backseat of a car like that, quieter. Somehow, even with the lights. Ava fell asleep again almost immediately, curled up against my side, her head in my lap. I kept my hand on her hair, anchoring both of us. Through the windshield, I watched the buildings change. Low brick structures giving way to glass and steel. Laundromats replaced by high-end boutiques with dark windows. Chloe met us near Adrian's building, scooped up into the operation in a way that made her eyes go wide. She didn't argue, though. She took one look at my face, then at Adrian, flanked by his men, and understood that whatever this was, it was bigger than either of us could handle alone. The building on the Upper East Side was exactly the kind of place I used to walk past on my way to the bus and wonder about. A quiet doorman, polished stone, a lobby that smelled like clean money. We took a private elevator that required a keycard and a code, and when the doors opened, we were standing directly in Adrian's home. Calling it an apartment feels wrong. It was a penthouse in every sense of the word. The first thing I saw was glass floor-to-ceiling windows stretching along the far wall, showing the city spread out like a living map below. Central Park was a dark rectangle dotted with distant lights. Inside, everything was smooth lines and warm tones. Deep gray sofas, thick rugs, art that was definitely real, not prints from a discount store. Soft light washed over everything, making it feel like dusk even though it was close to midnight. I felt small, stepping onto the hardwood in my worn sneakers, clutching a department store duffel, like I'd walked into a different planet's gravity. Chloe looked around once, whistled under her breath, and then immediately went back into big sister mode, taking Ava from my arms so I could breathe. Adrian didn't just wave us in and disappear. He walked us through the space, explaining quietly that the building had its own security, that his team covered the rest, that no one got up here without his say-so. He led us up a floating staircase to the second level, where the guest rooms were. Each one was bigger than my entire apartment, with its own bathroom and bed that looked like it could swallow you whole. He told me to choose whichever room I wanted for myself and Ava, and pointed out another for Chloe. I picked the one at the end of the hall, mostly because it had a window seat that looked out over the park. We tucked Ava into the giant bed together. She barely woke up, just mumbled something about the fancy hotel, and rolled over, wrapping herself around her bunny. I watched Adrian as he stood by the bedside for a moment. He didn't just glance and turn away. He looked at the drawings she'd already scattered from her backpack on the nightstand, at the way she kicked the covers half off. He reached down and gently pulled the blanket back up to her shoulders, his hand lingering for a second like he was memorizing the shape of this small person he had just taken responsibility for. In that quiet moment, the image of Ryan at the wedding flashed in my mind, his easy smile, his casual cruelty, when he pointed out the difference between his unborn legitimate child and the mistake that had cost me my degree. The contrast between the two men hit me so hard I almost had to sit down. The next few days blurred into a strange combination of sanctuary and tension. A pediatrician came the very next morning, arriving at 9 o'clock sharp with a little rolling suitcase of equipment. Adrian stayed for the entire exam, standing off to the side but paying close attention. He asked about Ava's growth chart, her vaccination records, and the lingering cough she sometimes got in the winter. He didn't talk over me, didn't undermine me. He just added questions I hadn't thought to ask and listened to the answers. By the second day, a tutor was arriving around 10 in the morning, a kind woman with a gentle voice and a stack of workbooks. She sat with Ava at the huge kitchen island, practicing letters and reading while Adrian took conference calls in his study. Sometimes, when his calls were done early, he would join them, leaning over the table, to help Ava sound out a tricky word or draw a better rectangle. I saw him in his element too. The study became the nerve center of whatever empire he ran. He'd shut the glass door, pick up his phone, and switch languages without thinking English to Italian and back. Sometimes something else that sounded sharp and clipped. His tone shifted, polite with some, icy with others. If I paused in the hallway, I could catch fragments about shipments and territories and agreements that sounded nothing like the menu planning I used to imagine restaurant owners did. And yet, an hour later, I would find him barefoot in the kitchen making pancakes at 8 in the morning because Ava had announced that pancakes were her favorite. He'd stand there in a perfectly fitted t-shirt, flipping batter like he'd done it his whole life, listening as she explained the plot of whatever cartoon she'd watched last. He remembered the way she liked them too many chocolate chips, not enough syrup, and kept a mental list of her preferences the way other men stored stock prices. At night, we ate at his massive dining table, just the three of us and sometimes Chloe if she wasn't working. The first few dinners were stiff. I kept waiting for some price to emerge, some obvious demand in exchange for all this protection. It never did. He asked about my day, about my patience, about how it felt to not be on my feet for 12 hours straight. He listened as the answers mattered. Little by little, the clenched fist in my chest started to loosen. I caught myself one afternoon standing at the window with a mug of coffee, looking out over the city, and realized I wasn't actively scanning for exits. For the first time in years, I wasn't doing math in my head about rent and utilities. I wasn't listening for someone trying to jiggle my door handle in the night. It scared me how easy it was to get used to that feeling. Of course, I knew it wasn't real in the permanent sense. This was a safe house, not a fairy tale. There was still a man named Viktor Orlov out there sending people to knock on doors with photographs on their phones. There were still secrets in Adrian's calls, deals happening in shadows I didn't understand. But inside these walls, for these few days, there was also laughter and shared meals and the sound of Ava's feet pounding down the hall as she ran to show Adrian a new drawing. Late one night, after Ava had finally fallen asleep and Chloe had gone to bed in her own guest room, I found myself on the small balcony off the living room. The city was laid out beneath me, all glitter and hum, like someone had overturned a jewelry box and left it that way. The air was cool against my bare arms. Behind me through the glass I could see the reflection of the penthouse. Soft lamps, a forgotten toy on the rug, a man in a dark sweater leaning against the doorway, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. We talked out there for a while about nothing and about everything. About his mother, who had pushed him to learn to cook and to dance. About my abandoned dreams of medical school. About the way the hospital felt both like a place of hope and a battlefield. He told me he hadn't planned on any of this. I admitted neither had I. At some point, the conversation fell away into silence. He stood beside me, closer than he had the right to stand, his shoulder a warm line against mine. The city kept breathing below us. For the first time since the wedding, I didn't feel like I was pretending to be someone I wasn't. I was just there, in his space, in his world, and it didn't feel entirely wrong. It hit me then, in that quiet, that whatever this had started as a favor on a dance floor, an arrangement in a car, had turned into something else entirely. I wasn't just grateful to the man who had pulled my daughter and me out of danger. I cared about him, about the way he listened, about the way he tucked Ava's blanket around her shoulders and asked my opinion before making decisions that affected us. Standing above the streets where I used to count every dollar, in a home that wasn't mine, next to a man whose name made criminals nervous, I realized something that scared me more than Viktor Orlov ever could. I was falling in love with Adrian Romano, and for a woman like me, in a world like his, that felt like stepping off another cliff, with no idea how hard the landing would be. The strange thing about living in a safe house is how quickly it starts to feel like a home you're not sure you're allowed to love. A few days after the knock on my apartment door, the penthouse had a rhythm. Ava knew where the cereal was, and which light switches worked, which lamps. Chloe had claimed a particular mug in the kitchen, and started leaving her charger plugged in by a specific outlet like a flag. I found myself remembering which drawer held the good knives, which cabinet had the extra towels. It was domestic in a way my life hadn't felt in a long time, even though there was armed security in the lobby and men who could snap bones with one hand moving through the shadows. On the surface, things were calm. Ava adored the tutor, and had decided Adrian's kitchen was the best place on earth purely because of the pancake-to-fruit ratio. Chloe moved through the space like a wary cat, but even she had started to relax a little, joking that if I ever kicked Adrian out, she would gladly move in and take over. Underneath, we all knew this was borrowed peace. Adrian was still doing whatever he did behind closed doors. His study door would shut, and his voice would harden as he spoke in Italian, then Russian accented English, then back again. Names floated through those conversations like storm clouds. Orlov, numbers that meant territory or money or maybe lives. Every now and then, his eyes would be darker than usual when he emerged, and Lucas would be waiting in the hallway with a tablet and more bad news. It was on one of those days that the betrayal came out. I was sitting at the kitchen island with a cup of coffee, watching Ava and the tutor sort colored pencils into little piles, when I heard my name. Not in the casual, everyday way. In the way that means something is wrong. Adrian called me into the study with that tone that made the air feel heavier. Lucas was already there, standing beside the desk, tablet in hand. The screen showed a familiar photo. Adrian and me at the wedding, frozen mid-dance. I'd seen it in my nightmares and in the memory loop I ran every time I questioned how I'd ended up here. Seeing it glowing on Lucas's screen in Adrian's study made my stomach flip. They had found the leak, Lucas explained. The person who had flagged me for Viktor Orlov's people, who had sent the photos and my details and told them that the woman from Queens, suddenly attached to Adrian Romano, might make good leverage. And it was family. Derek Cole, my cousin, the one who always had a new job every month, a new scheme every season, the one who had asked to borrow money at Thanksgiving and got angry when I said I couldn't help anymore. Apparently, gambling didn't care that you were bad at picking winners. Debt collectors didn't care that you were out of excuses. At some point, he'd met someone connected to Orlov's organization, and when the pressure got bad enough, he'd traded whatever information he could for a little bit of air, including me. I listened as Lucas laid it all out. Derek had been feeding them tidbits for months who in our extended family had money, who had influence, who was connected to whom. When he saw the wedding pictures on social media and realized I'd shown up on the arm of a man like Adrian, he had gone back to them with a shiny new toy. A single mom nurse, living alone in Queens, was suddenly linked to a name they already had on their radar. When I heard that Orlov's people had grabbed Derek too, my reaction surprised even me. There was a flash of satisfaction, ugly and sharp. This is what you get, something inside me hissed, for selling out your own blood. It was followed almost immediately by a wave of nausea. Because, as worthless as Derek's choices had been, he was still the kid who'd shared his Halloween candy with me when we were 7. He did something terrible, but he didn't deserve to be tortured in some dark room just to make a point. I felt all of that at once: betrayal, anger, sick worry, and sat down hard in the chair across from Adrian's desk because my legs didn't feel steady. Adrian watched me for a moment. He didn't try to explain away Derek's actions or soften the reality. He just let the weight of it land. Then he said what I already knew was coming. There would have to be a meeting. Orlov had pushed too far. He'd sent men to my door. He'd taken Derek as insurance. If Adrian ignored it, it would be read as a weakness. If he responded with violence, Derek would be the first to pay for it. So he needed to sit across from the man himself and draw a line. In that world, apparently, there is a ritual for everything, even for deciding who is allowed to threaten whose family. He intended to go without me. The moment he said it, something in me rebelled. I understood his reasoning, the warehouse, the men, the danger, but the idea of being discussed like a broken piece of machinery in a backroom deal made me feel like my skin was inside out. Orlov had used me specifically. He'd sent his people to my home. He had turned my front door into a weapon. I could feel myself shaking as I told Adrian I wasn't going to sit this one out. I reminded him that I was the leverage, that he could pretend all he wanted, that this was just about business. But at the end of the day, it was my life and Ava's life that had been put on the table. If Orlov wanted to see a frightened, silent woman hiding behind a powerful man, I had no intention of giving him that satisfaction. We went back and forth. I could see the muscle ticking in Adrian's jaw, could hear the edge of real anger in his voice when he said he would not risk me in a room like that. I heard my own voice too, quiet but strangely steady, saying I was already at risk just by being tied to him. That, at least, this way I would get to speak for myself. In the end, he agreed, but on conditions. I would stay beside him at all times. I would follow his lead. If he gave me even the smallest signal, I would walk out. No arguments. I nodded, even though we both knew that promises made in safety don't always hold the same shape in a warehouse, lit by flickering fluorescent tubes. The night of the meeting, the city felt different. We drove to an industrial part of Brooklyn, where the streets ran wide and empty between warehouses that smelled like rust and old oil. The SUV's headlights cut through pools of shadow, catching on broken pallets and metal doors tagged with graffiti. There were other cars already there, a line of black sedans and SUVs parked near a loading dock under a single buzzing light. Inside, the warehouse was colder than outside. Concrete floors, high ceilings with beams disappearing into the darkness. The air tasted metallic, tinged with something chemical. It echoed strangely, each footstep stretching out longer than it should have. In the center of all that empty space was a folding table with 3 chairs on each side, like a bizarre parody of a job interview. Orlov was already seated when we walked in. He was older than Adrian, late 50s maybe, with hair cut close to his skull and a face carved into hard lines over decades. He wasn't big, not physically, but there was a density to him, like a gravity field. Beside him stood a younger man with the same cold eyes I'd seen at my door that night. A couple of others lingered by the walls, shadows with hands in jackets. Adrian sat on one side of the table, Lucas at his shoulder. I stood just behind his right shoulder, close enough to feel the tension in his back through the fabric of his coat. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my fingertips, but I forced myself to focus on details. The scuff on the concrete near the table leg, the way Orlov's fingers tapped once on the tabletop, the slight hum of a generator somewhere in the building. They started by talking about things that had nothing and everything to do with me. Territories, agreements, the way certain streets were expected to remain off-limits to certain operations. It felt surreal listening to them discuss neighborhoods like they were squares on a board game, each block a chip to be moved and traded. Then the conversation shifted. Orlov brought up Derek. He described him with casual contempt, weak, foolish, useful. He mentioned how easily Derek had given up information on his own family. My stomach twisted again, but I kept my face as neutral as I could. And then he talked about me. He referred to me as leverage. Not as a person, as leverage. The girl with the kid is living alone. The soft spot. The pressure point on Adrian's otherwise solid armor. The way he said it. Like it was clever and inevitable. Like it was just good strategy. Hit something in me I hadn't realized was still raw. I thought about my mother's careful disapproval. About Ryan's little speech in the hospital hallway. About Derek sending my name and address to a man like this for cash. Every time, someone had decided I was the weak point, the problem, the thing to manipulate. It was always my fault, my vulnerability, my life on the table. Something in me snapped into place. I heard my own voice before I fully realized I was speaking. I didn't shout. If anything, my words came out too calm. I told Orlov that he had chosen the wrong woman to treat like an object, that I wasn't just a piece on Adrian's board, that I was a pediatric nurse, and that every day I walked into rooms where children were fighting battles they hadn't chosen, and parents were breaking silently in corners, that I knew what real courage looked like, and it definitely wasn't sending men to bang on a single mother's door in the middle of the night. I felt my hands shaking, but I didn't stop. I told him about Ava asleep in her bed that night, about the way her stuffed rabbit had almost fallen to the floor when I ran in to check on her after his men left. I asked him, out loud in that echoing space, what kind of man built power out of scaring women and children in their own homes? What kind of empire needed that to stay standing? For a second, the entire warehouse went so quiet I could hear the faint buzz of the overhead light. Orlov looked at me, really looked at me. For the first time, there was a flicker of something almost like surprise in his eyes, maybe even grudging respect, before his expression slid back into neutrality. Adrian was still beside me, still solid and unmoving. But I could feel a different kind of energy radiating off him now, like he was torn between wanting to drag me behind him and wanting to stand back and let me burn the room down. He chose to use the moment instead. He laid out his offer in that same controlled voice he'd used all night. He said Orlov would get what he thought he wanted 3 blocks in the financial district, the ones they'd been pushing at for months. But those blocks, Adrian knew, and Orlov didn't, were about to be hit with zoning changes that would tank their value. Construction, regulation, and inspectors. A headache wrapped as a prize. In exchange, Adrian demanded 2 things. 1. Derek's release alive, not maimed, not left in a ditch somewhere as a message. 2. Civilians off limits from this point forward, especially families, especially children, especially the woman standing behind him and the little girl who slept in his home now. No more visits. No more knocks. No more using people who never chose this life as leverage in games they don't even understand. He framed it as practical. Violence against civilians brings heat. Heat is bad for business. Keeping the lines clean benefits everyone. But I heard the layer underneath, the one that sounded a lot like a man drawing a circle around the people he cared about and daring anyone to step inside it. Orlov took his time answering. He leaned back in his chair and studied me again, then Adrian. He pointed out that Adrian was giving up a lot on paper. Adrian didn't flinch. Finally, Orlov nodded once, like a king dispensing mercy. He said Derek would be dropped at a hospital before the night was over, that a car would leave him there with enough cash to get lost for a while. He said the 3 blocks would be theirs by the end of the week, and then he said something I'm still not sure I know how to feel about. He said women who speak that way, in rooms like this, are rare. That his own wife had been like that once. Men who are smart do not waste women like that. The handshake that followed felt like a scene from a movie I never wanted to be in. 2 men, both capable of ordering terrible things, clasped hands over a table while I stood there with my heart pounding like a drum. A deal made. A temporary peace bought with real estate and promises. And the thin, fragile agreement that certain lines would not be crossed. The ride back to the city was quieter than the one there. I sat in the back seat, hands still trembling slightly in my lap. My body was coming down from adrenaline, and it made me feel hollow and too full at the same time. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see Adrian watching me, his jaw tight. He finally told me that what I had done back there was either the bravest thing he'd ever seen or the stupidest, and that he hadn't yet decided which. I told him I wasn't sure either. All I knew was that I hadn't been able to stay quiet while men who made decisions with guns and money talked about my life like it was a bargaining chip. Underneath his frustration, I could hear something else. A thread of awe, respect, maybe even fear not of Orlov, but of what it meant that a woman with no power in that world had still stood up and said no. Back at the penthouse, after Lucas peeled off to handle the paperwork of transferring those blocks and confirming Derek's release, I stood alone for a minute in the dark kitchen. The city glowed outside. Ava was upstairs, asleep in a bed that did not belong to her but had become hers anyway. Chloe was probably scrolling on her phone, pretending she wasn't waiting for my footsteps in the hall. I realized that this night had changed something fundamental. I had walked into a warehouse full of dangerous men and, for the first time in my life, refused to let them define the terms of my existence. I had drawn a line with nothing but my voice and the memory of children I'd held while they cried. And it had worked, at least for now. A circle had been drawn around me and Ava me, not just by Adrian's power, but by the boundary I insisted on. But that line had a cost. With every step deeper into Adrian's world, I was binding myself more tightly to the same system that made Orlov possible in the first place. I had let a deal that traded city blocks for safety be made partly in my name. I had walked out alive, but I wasn't the same woman who'd paced a tiny queen's apartment counting tips. I was something else now, something that scared me and thrilled me in equal measure. And as much as I wanted to pretend this was the end of it, I knew better. The Russians had agreed to keep civilians off limits, but there were people in my life, ex-husbands, broken cousins, parents with sharp tongues who weren't bound by any code but their own. The next blows might not come from men with tattoos and cold eyes. They might come from my own blood. There was one thing I didn't tell you about that night at the warehouse. I glossed over the car ride home, wrapped it up neatly by saying it was quiet and tense, and that much was true, but it wasn't the whole story. My brain likes to protect me like that, rounding off the edges of the sharpest moments until I'm ready to look at them straight on. Right after that handshake, right after the concrete and fluorescent lights and Viktor Orlov's cold eyes, we walked back to the SUV like we were leaving a funeral. Lucas climbed into the front passenger seat, stone-faced. I slid into the back, and Adrian came in after me, the door shutting with a heavy sound that felt final. The driver pulled away from the warehouse, and the city swallowed us up again. For a while, nobody said anything. I remember staring at my hands resting on my jeans and noticing how badly they were shaking now that I wasn't in performance mode. It felt like my body had decided the danger was technically over, so it could finally cash the check for all that adrenaline. My chest was tight, my throat burned, and my brain kept replaying the moment I opened my mouth in front of Orlov like a movie clip I couldn't pause. At some point, I realized Adrian was watching me, not in a casual way, not in the way men look when they're mentally somewhere else, fully watching, like he was trying to decide if I was going to fall apart, or maybe like he was halfway furious and halfway impressed and not sure which half was winning. He told me, in that low, controlled tone, that what I had done was reckless. Men like Orlov did not like being challenged, especially by someone outside their world. There were 100 ways that could have gone wrong, but under the criticism, I heard something else. I heard the catch in his voice when he admitted he had never seen anyone talk to Orlov like that and walk out again. I heard the part of him that wanted to yell at me for scaring him, and the part that wanted to pull me against him because I had just drawn a line around a child sleeping 3 miles away and dared anyone to cross it. I told him the truth. At that time, I hadn't been thinking about power structures or consequences. I'd been thinking about Ava's pink sneakers by the front door of my old apartment, about the kids at the hospital who didn't get a say in what happened to their bodies, about Derek's stupid choices, and the way men like Orlov treated people like disposable tools. If I was going to be leveraged in someone else's game, I at least wanted to hear my own voice in the room. He went quiet after that. The SUV hummed along the highway, streetlights sliding over his face in soft gold and shadow. The city got closer, brighter. My heart was still beating too fast. Then he did something I hadn't seen him do before. He let the mask slip a little. He admitted that somewhere between that first dance at my sister's wedding and my speech in the warehouse, it had stopped being an arrangement for him, that he had told himself this was practical for both of us, that it was about keeping his family and mine off his back, but that he'd been lying to himself more than anyone. Watching me stand in front of a man like Orlov and refuse to bow had made something inside him shift in a way he couldn't pretend away anymore. Listening to him say that broke open something in me too, because I had been keeping my feelings in a locked drawer for days now, telling myself what I felt was gratitude, attraction, adrenaline, anything but the obvious. Sitting next to him in that dark car, knowing what we'd just walked out of together, I couldn't keep pretending. There was a moment where it could have gone either way. I could have made a joke, thrown up a wall, or changed the subject. That's what I used to do with Ryan, deflect whenever things got too real. Instead, I let myself lean that last inch toward him. The kiss didn't feel like fireworks. It felt like exhaling after holding my breath underwater for too long. 1 second, there was space between us. The next, his hand was at the back of my neck, warm and steady, pulling me closer. His mouth was on mine, firm but not demanding, like he was giving me every opportunity to pull away if I wanted to. My hand ended up fisted in the front of his coat, not to push him back but to anchor myself. I'd forgotten what it felt like to be kissed by someone who wasn't trying to win, or prove something, or take. There was heat, sure, more than I was ready to admit out loud, but there was also this strange sense of safety, like the world outside that SUV might still be a mess. But in this tiny space, at this exact moment, I was allowed to just be held. When we finally separated, we didn't rush to fill the silence. The city kept moving outside. My lips tingled. My heart felt like it had skipped a step and was trying to catch up. We didn't label anything. We didn't suddenly start calling it love. But the air between us had shifted. Whatever we had walked into that warehouse as, we were not walking out as the same two people. Back at the penthouse, the first thing I did was go upstairs and check on Ava. She was sprawled across the big bed, hair all over the pillow, one arm thrown over her stuffed bunny. The sight of her knocked me back into perspective. This was why any of this mattered. This was why it was so terrifying to feel what I was starting to feel for the man who had just kissed me in the back of a car. Later, in the kitchen, with the city spread out outside the windows and the dishwasher humming softly, I stood across from Adrian with a glass of water in my hand and admitted something, not with words, not yet, but in the way I met his eyes and didn't look away. If I stayed in this world, in his home, it wasn't just going to be about safety anymore. It was going to be because of him. That scared me almost as much as Orlov did. A few days after that, I made a decision that shocked both of us. I told Adrian I wanted to go back to work. On paper, it didn't make sense. We'd just negotiated a fragile peace. There were still people watching street corners with the wrong kind of interest. The penthouse was the safest place I'd ever been. But I could feel myself slipping into this new role, protected woman in a high-rise, and as intoxicating as it wasn't the whole of who I was. I needed the hospital. I needed the chaos of the pediatric ward, the beeping machines, the kids with superhero blankets, and terrified parents. I needed to remember that my hands could do more than hold on to him in the back of a car. Adrian didn't like it. I could see that. But he respected it. He called someone that same afternoon, and by the time my first shift came around, I had a driver, a new parking arrangement, and a quiet, unassuming security guy who was suddenly always in the general vicinity of the nurse's entrance without ever officially existing. Going back through those hospital doors felt like stepping into my old life, wearing a new skin. My coworkers hugged me and made jokes about rich boyfriends and mysterious emergencies. The kids didn't care. They just wanted their meds and their cartoons and someone to tell them it would hurt less soon. For 12 hours, I was Nurse Cole again, and it was both a relief and a strange kind of whiplash. It was only when I walked into the parking garage that evening, around 7, that the new reality crashed back in. Hospital parking structures are eerie at night. Concrete, bad lighting, echoes. I was tired in that way that makes your bones feel hollow. Keys in my hand, brain already thinking about what Ava might have done with the tutor and whether Adrian had managed to cook without burning anything. I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, and there he was. Ryan, standing between two parked cars, hands in his pockets like this was some casual run-in and not something he'd planned. The sight of him there, in my space, after everything that had happened, hit me in a different way than Orlov's men had. With Orlov, at least I knew what he was. With Ryan, the danger came wrapped in familiarity and history, and a face I had once trusted enough to build a family with. He went straight for it. Told me he'd done his homework on Adrian. That he knew Adrian's reputation went beyond owning restaurants and buying nice suits. He tossed around words like organized crime and dangerous, framing himself as the concerned father who'd just discovered his kid's mother was living with a man like that. He grabbed my arm, not enough to bruise, just enough to trap, and leaned on every insecurity he knew I had. He painted a picture of judges and custody hearings, of social workers asking why I thought it was acceptable to expose our daughter to a known criminal. He talked about going to the police, about doing what's best for Ava, as if those words had ever guided a single decision he'd made in his life. There was a particular line he crossed when he implied that I was reckless, that I was choosing romance over my daughter's safety. That one stung more than anything, because that's the knife you can always twist in a mother, make her question if she's failing the one person she's supposed to protect most. For a moment, I was back in our old apartment, 9 weeks pregnant and alone, listening to him explain why he wasn't ready and why this wasn't what he signed up for. Except now he'd found a way to take that same selfishness and wrap it in fake nobility. Before I could decide whether to yell, cry, or knee him in the groin, another presence entered the scene. I didn't see Adrian and Lucas at first. I just heard that low, calm voice cut through the parking garage noise, and then suddenly Ryan's grip loosened because he'd looked up and realized we weren't alone. Adrian stepped into the space between cars, like he owned the entire structure. He didn't shout. He didn't posture. He just carried himself like a man who knew he had the upper hand before the conversation even started. Lucas was beside him, hands empty but posture alert. There was a brief moment where Ryan tried to reframe things, saying he was just here to talk to the mother of his child, that this was a private matter. The security camera in the corner, and the way my arm still tingled where he'd grabbed it, told a different story. Then Lucas pulled an envelope from his jacket and held it out. What I didn't know, what I learned right there in that damp, echoing concrete box, was that Adrian had expected this. The moment he realized Ryan was the kind of man who walked out on a pregnant woman and then tried to shame her years later, he'd had people look into his history. Child support records, employment, paper trails. Inside that envelope were years of receipts. Proof that every month, Ryan had paid nothing or the bare minimum. Records of no visits, no calls, no attempts to see Ava. A draft petition for back child support with interest. Notes from a lawyer ready to argue that the only unfit parent in this equation was the one who had abandoned his family when it mattered. Adrian didn't threaten to have Ryan beaten, or disappear, or any of the other awful things a man like him probably could arrange. He calmly laid out the realities of what a court would see if Ryan tried to make this official. A judge looking at dates and signatures and realizing that the man now claiming the moral high ground had been a ghost for 5 years. He gave Ryan a choice without ever using that word. Walk away, stop harassing me, and live your shiny new life without us. No one files anything, nothing changes. Or push this, and watch your reputation shredded in a courtroom where the only thing that matters is what you did, not what you say you care about now. I watched the fight drain out of Ryan's face as he flipped through those pages. For once, he came up against a kind of power he couldn't charm or bully his way past. Legal, precise, backed by someone with more resources than he'd ever have. He threw the envelope back as it burned, spat something about me regretting this, and stalked off to his car. The sound of his engine fading down the ramp felt like something closing for good. On the ride back to the penthouse, I sat in the SUV in a different kind of silence than the one after the warehouse. This time, the adrenaline wasn't just from fear, but from a strange, disorienting relief. Someone had finally stood between Ryan and me and said, "No more, not with fists, not with threats whispered in dark alleys, but with paperwork and facts and consequences." Adrian told me then that he wasn't trying to take over my choices, that if I wanted to pursue those legal options, they were mine. If I wanted to let them sit in a drawer as a warning, that was mine too. What mattered to him was that I never again felt trapped in a corner by a man who had already proven he wouldn't be there when it counted. I looked at him in the dim light of the car and realized that whatever name the world used for him, criminal, boss, dangerous, he was also the only person who had ever really fought for my daughter and me on every level. With muscle when needed, yes, but also with contracts and lawyers, and the kind of preparation that said he expected trouble and was ready to meet it. That night, back in the kitchen with the city outside and the penthouse lights low, I let myself admit something I'd been circling for days. I was already in too deep to pretend this was temporary. My life, my safety, my heart, my daughter's future, they were all tangled up with his now. Walking away wasn't just a matter of packing a suitcase and catching a subway back to Queens. It would mean stepping out from under the only real shield we'd ever had, and the scariest part wasn't that I might not be able to leave. It was that, for the first time, I wasn't sure I wanted to. By the time my sister's birthday rolled around, the city felt quieter around me. Not actually quieter, this was still New York. After all, but the noise in my head had dialed down. Orlov was keeping his distance, at least for now. Ryan had slunk back into whatever life he'd built for himself since he walked out on us, apparently smart enough to recognize what a lawyer with real resources could do to his image. The constant hum of threat had leveled off into something I could almost ignore long enough to breathe. Life settled into this odd, stitched-together routine. Weekdays, I put on scrubs in a penthouse on the Upper East Side, kissed my daughter's curls while she ate cereal at a marble island, and then rode down in a private elevator to be driven to a children's hospital in Queens, where parents handed me their fears in paper cups of bad coffee. After 12 hours of codes and cartoons and IV pumps, I came home to a man whose name made tough men nervous, who would hand me a glass of wine and ask about the kid I'd been worrying over since 10 that morning. Ava slipped into this double life faster than I did. She learned quickly that on school days, she saw me in scrubs, and at night, she could curl up on a couch big enough to swallow us both. She knew the driver by name. She knew where Adrian hid the good snacks. She started referring to the penthouse as home without even realizing she'd done it. Chloe adapted in her own way. She still called me out whenever she thought I was getting lost in the fairy tale side of all this, but she stopped flinching every time a security guy passed through the hall. She started teasing Adrian about his coffee habits, which is its own form of acceptance in her language. Even with all of that, there was one line I hadn't crossed yet: bringing my family fully into his world. They knew about him, of course. My mother had Googled him so aggressively that I was surprised she hadn't crashed her tablet. My dad had asked dry questions about his business interests at Sunday dinner, eyes narrowing like he was trying to figure out if I was repeating old mistakes with a shinier coat of paint. My older sister, Emily, had watched me with that big sister mix of skepticism and worry that always made me feel 13 again. So when Emily decided she wanted a small dinner for her birthday instead of a big party, and my mother floated the idea that maybe this year we could try somewhere nice, I felt the universe nudging me to stop hiding. Adrian didn't hesitate. When I mentioned that my family was thinking of going to a mid-range Italian place near my parents' house, he simply shook his head like that was a cute joke. He suggested his flagship restaurant in Midtown instead, the one I knew mostly from articles about power dining in the city. He said he'd close off the second floor for us. Make it private and relaxed. Nothing too formal. I nodded like this was normal. Inside, my stomach rolled. The idea of my mother sitting under actual chandeliers, making polite conversation with a man whose world I barely understood, felt like an experiment that could go very, very wrong. The night of the dinner, I spent more time getting ready than I wanted to admit. It wasn't about impressing Adrian. He'd seen me barefoot in an oversized t-shirt, hair tossed into a bun that had lost the battle 6 hours into a shift. It was about facing my mother's eyes across a linen tablecloth and not feeling like the poor relation who'd shown up in the wrong costume. I chose a simple black dress that actually fit, with soft fabric that moved when I did. Ava twirled around the bedroom in a navy velvet dress Adrian had insisted on buying, the kind with a little bow at the back. She kept asking when we were going to Daddy's restaurant, and every time the word slipped out of her mouth, it hit me in the chest like a soft hammer. Adrian met us in the living room in a dark blue suit, no tie, the top button of his shirt undone. He looked like the version of himself the world knew. Polished, composed, just dangerous enough to make waiters stand a little straighter when he walked past. But when he looked at Ava and told her she looked like a princess, his face softened in a way the world didn't get to see. The restaurant was one of those places that makes you lower your voice automatically. Warm light, floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the river, soft music that sounded expensive even from a distance. Staff greeted Adrian by name, not the way they greet customers, but the way soldiers greet a commanding officer they'd actually follow. My family was already there when we arrived, gathered awkwardly near the hostess stand like they weren't sure where to put their hands. My mother wore her good navy dress, the one she saved for weddings and funerals. My father had on a blazer I hadn't seen since Emily's graduation. Emily and her husband hovered nearby, and my younger cousin Jenna was doing a bad job of pretending she wasn't craning her neck to take in every detail. For a second, seeing them all against this backdrop, I wanted to grab Ava's hand and bolt. The class difference, the life difference, the everything difference felt like a physical gap between us. Adrian closed that gap in about 3 seconds. He greeted my mother with a kind of old-world politeness that made her posture straighten. He called my father Sir, without sounding fake. He remembered Emily's name without being prompted, and asked about her work in a way that made it clear he'd listened when I'd rambled about her latest promotion. He bent down to Ava's level when she tugged his sleeve, introducing her to my parents like she was the guest of honor. The staff led us upstairs to a private room with a long table set in the center. Candles flickered along the middle, casting everything in a soft glow that made even my mother's frown lines look gentler. The room had a terrace attached, glass doors closed against the March chill but promising a stunning view if anyone wanted air later. I took my seat halfway down the table. Adrian sat to my right, Ava perched happily between us, feet swinging under her chair. My parents settled opposite. Emily and her husband took the far end, nearest the windows, while Jenna slid in next to me with the eager energy of someone who lives for family gossip. The first few minutes were exactly as awkward as I'd anticipated. My mother commented on the decor with the air of someone trying not to sound impressed. My father focused on the menu as if it were a contract. Emily watched Adrian like he was a patient she was trying to diagnose from across the room. Then Ava broke the tension the way only a 5-year-old can. She announced to the table that this place had the best bread in the entire world, because Adrian always told the chef to make it extra hot for her. The server, right on cue, appeared with a basket of bread that smelled like heaven, and a small, deliberately fancy-looking mocktail in a stemmed glass just for Ava, complete with a little orange twist. Watching my daughter sip a bright red drink like she was a movie star, while my parents tried to pretend this was normal, did something to me. For once, I wasn't embarrassed by what I couldn't give her. I was grateful for what I could, even if it came from a world that scared me. As the courses arrived, the conversation loosened. My father, who usually stuck to weather and sports, started asking Adrian how he'd gotten into the restaurant business. Adrian told a story about his mother teaching him to cook in a cramped Brooklyn kitchen, about saving up to open his first tiny place before he ever owned anything like this. He talked more about the food and the staff than about money or status, and I watched my dad's shoulders decompress with every sentence. My mother watched the way Adrian cut Ava's chicken without being asked, how he wiped a smudge of sauce from her chin with a napkin and a small smile, how he listened to her rambling story about a book she'd read at school like it was actually riveting. I could almost see the gears turning behind my mother's eyes as she adjusted the picture she'd been holding in her head of the kind of man Hannah ends up with. At one point, I slipped away to the restroom, partly out of necessity, partly to breathe. Emily followed a minute later, cornering me by the sinks, the way she used to when we were teenagers, trying to talk without our parents hearing. She leaned against the counter and just looked at me for a long moment. Then she told me, in her own blunt way, that she hadn't seen me this relaxed in years. She admitted she'd been worried when she heard the word Romano attached to my new life. She wasn't naive. She read the news, but that watching him tonight, with Ava, with our parents, was shifting something for her. She said he seemed like the kind of man who took responsibility seriously, the kind who showed up, the kind who understood that family was both a weakness and a strength, and protected it anyway. For a second, I felt 13 again, desperate for my big sister's approval. Hearing that she saw something solid in us, in him, settled a knot in my chest I hadn't realized was still there. Back at the table, I caught my mother giving me a look I hadn't seen in a long time. Not pity, not judgment, something closer to cautious pride. Later, when the dessert plates were cleared and the candles burned lower, she leaned over and told me that whatever else could be said about my choices, I had clearly picked a man who cared about my daughter, and that counted for a lot in her book. Jenna, never one to miss a chance for drama, waited until coffee to drop her own little observation. She mentioned, in a low voice only I could hear, that she had seen Ryan recently, and that he did not look like a man who was sleeping well. She said Kayla, his wife, had made a comment about how marriage was not what she expected. Jenna grinned and told me, with zero subtlety, that being left might have been the best thing that ever happened to me. I didn't answer out loud. I didn't need to. The moment that landed hardest came near the end of the night. My father stood to put on his coat, paused, and turned back to Adrian. He reached out his hand, and Adrian took it. It was a simple gesture, nothing dramatic, but I grew up reading my father's silences like weather reports. That handshake, that extra beat where their eyes met, carried a message even he probably couldn't put into words. It said, "I see what you're doing for my daughter. I see the way you look at my granddaughter. I might not understand your world, but if you keep taking care of them, I'm not going to stand in the way." On the ride back to the penthouse, Ava fell asleep in her car seat, one hand still sticky from dessert, her head lolling to the side. I watched the city slide past the window and tried to wrap my mind around the fact that my parents had just spent 3 hours eating food they couldn't pronounce in a building their daughters, whatever he was, owned. Upstairs, after we tucked Ava into bed and checked that Chloe had gotten home safely, Adrian and I ended up on the little terrace off the living room. The air was cold enough to bite, but the view stole most of my attention. The grid of streets below, the dark shape of the park, the thousands of windows lit up like stars. I told him that my family liked him. The words felt almost foreign in my mouth, like I'd borrowed them from someone else's life. He answered with a wry little smile, but there was relief there too, in the set of his shoulders, in the way he exhaled, as if he'd been holding his breath all evening too. Standing there, wrapped in his coat because I'd stepped outside without one, I realized something simple and huge at the same time. This wasn't pretend anymore. It hadn't been for a while, but tonight had made it official in a way I hadn't anticipated. My family had seen us together, seen him with my daughter, and instead of shaking their heads and predicting disaster, they had quietly, messily, imperfectly accepted that this was real. For the first time since a pregnancy test turned my life upside down, I could think about the future and not feel my stomach drop. I didn't know exactly what it would look like, what compromises it would demand, what dangers still lurked around the edges. But as I stood on that terrace with his arms around me and the city breathing below, I allowed myself to imagine it. Not just surviving day to day, not just scraping by, an actual life, with him, with Ava, with family dinners that didn't end in tears or slammed doors. I didn't know then that he was already planning his next move, that there was a velvet box hidden somewhere in that penthouse. I just knew that if he ever asked me to step fully into his world, not just as the woman he protected but as the partner he claimed openly, this night had already given me my answer. If the night of my sister's birthday dinner was the night my family quietly accepted us, then what happened a couple of weeks later was the night I finally accepted us too. Life in that in-between time felt strangely normal for something that involved a penthouse, private drivers, and a man who could shut down a street with one phone call. I went to the hospital, argued with insurance reps, coaxed kids into taking meds, and snuck graham crackers to toddlers who had been stuck in bed for days. Then I came home to a place with floor-to-ceiling windows and a man stirring sauce in a designer kitchen while my daughter sat on the counter drawing dinosaurs with the world's most intimidating bodyguard. Ava only became more attached to Adrian. She started leaving drawings on his desk in the study crayon versions of our little trio, always with him drawn taller than the buildings. She would ask, in that matter-of-fact kid way, if he could come to school events, or if he would be there when she lost her next tooth. The first time she referred to him as her dad in front of Chloe, she didn't even realize she'd done it. Chloe caught my eye, and I had that moment where your heart both soars and panics at the same time. My parents stopped asking questions that sounded like cross-examination. My mom called me one afternoon to ask what Adrian's favorite dessert was because she was thinking of trying a new recipe for the next time we came over. My dad brought over a bottle of decent wine as a thank you for the restaurant dinner, which in his language was basically a standing ovation. I could feel it building this pressure in my chest that said, we couldn't just float in this undefined space forever. We were already living like a family. We shared routines, responsibilities, and arguments about where Ava's shoes should go. The only thing we hadn't done was name what we were. Then one morning, Adrian mentioned a dinner. He framed it as a kind of celebration. He said he wanted to host something small at the Midtown restaurant to mark what he called a new chapter. He said it with this casual tone, but I could see the edges of nervous energy in him, the way his fingers drummed against the coffee mug a little too fast. He told me he'd invited my parents, Emily and her husband, Jenna, and of course Chloe. He had asked Lucas and his wife to come too. He said it would be relaxed, just family and the people who had somehow become family, to celebrate making it through a rough season and moving into something steadier. Ava, meanwhile, was practically buzzing. She kept talking about having a special job that she had to practice for, but every time I asked, she would press her lips together and announce that it was a secret between her and Adrian. At one point I heard her in the hallway rehearsing what sounded like steps and turns, counting them under her breath. When I asked Adrian about it, he only smiled in that infuriating way that says he knows more than he is willing to share. The night of the dinner, the city felt crisp and sharp, the kind of cool spring evening where the air smells like rain and possibilities. I wore a deep green dress that Chloe had bullied me into buying, the color making my eyes look less exhausted than I actually was. Ava wore soft burgundy, her hair in loose curls with a tiny clip shaped like a star. She kept patting the little purse hanging across her body, like she was checking that whatever was inside was still there. When we stepped into the restaurant, it felt different from the last time. The staff were still polished, the lighting still warm, but there was an extra charge in the air, like the whole building was holding its breath. A small band was set up in the corner of the second floor, playing low, easy music that hummed under the conversation instead of competing with it. My parents arrived a few minutes after us, my mother wearing her pearls, my father in the same blazer he'd worn before. Emily and her husband showed up with a wrapped book-shaped gift for Ava, because my sister is nothing if not on brand. Chloe breezed in late, kissed my cheek, and whispered that tonight felt important in a way she couldn't yet name. Dinner started out like any other family gathering, just with better food and nicer plates. Adrian moved around the room as he belonged everywhere at once. He checked on the kitchen, spoke quietly with the band, pulled out my mother's chair, poured my father's wine, and helped Ava climb onto hers. Staff flowed in and out with platters and bottles, but once everyone had plates in front of them, the focus shifted to the table. I sat there and watched my worlds hold hands without fighting. Chloe made my mother laugh, which is something I had previously thought physically impossible. My dad and Lucas ended up talking about baseball, both pretending they didn't know the other had done things that would probably make the average fan clutch their pearls. Ava climbed down from her chair at one point to show my mother a drawing she'd done that afternoon of the restaurant, with all of us sitting around a table and little musical notes floating above the band. Somewhere between the pasta course and the sea bass, I realized Adrian was quieter than usual, not absent or brooding, just more focused. His attention kept snagging on me like he was mentally checking that I was still there. His knee bumped mine under the table, and instead of pulling back, he left it there, a warm, steady reminder. He looked at Ava with this complicated mix of tenderness and determination. Every time our eyes met, something unspoken passed between us, and my stomach did that weightless thing again. Then the main plates were cleared, and the band shifted into a softer, almost familiar song. Adrian stood up. He didn't tap a glass or give some grand speechy gesture. He just rose, the way he did in boardrooms and backrooms, and the energy at the table shifted without anyone needing to be told. Conversations tapered off as people realized he was about to say something important. I watched him take a breath, the kind you take before you step onto a ledge. He started talking not in quotes, not in lines, but in a flow that felt like it was meant for me and just happened to have an audience. He talked about the night at my sister's wedding, how he had seen me at that leftover table in the back and thought my loneliness was the loudest thing in the room. He admitted that when he walked over and asked me to pretend, he told himself it was practical, a mutually beneficial arrangement, nothing more. He talked about the moments that had cracked that lie. Me dancing with him like I wasn't afraid of being seen anymore. Me holding my daughter in his penthouse and still saying I didn't trust easily. Me standing in a warehouse and telling Victor Orlov he didn't get to use mothers and children as leverage in his games. As he spoke, faces from the past few weeks flickered through my mind like shots in a movie. The way Ryan's hand had clenched around my arm in the hospital garage, the rust smell of that warehouse. My mother's face at the first restaurant dinner, softening as she watched him with Ava. The backseat of his SUV after Orlov, when I had leaned in that final inch and changed everything. He said something then that landed in my chest and stayed there. That at some point, he had stopped planning for the day this arrangement would end, and started planning for how to build a life where it didn't have to. Then he looked at Ava. That was her cue. She slid off her chair with a seriousness that made the entire table smile. She walked around to Adrian, counting her steps under her breath the way she'd been practicing at home. She reached into her tiny purse and pulled out a small velvet pouch, then pressed it into his hand with the importance of a royal messenger. He bent down and kissed the top of her head. Then he turned to me. Seeing him drop to one knee might have been the strangest part of all. This man, who was used to having others lower their eyes and follow his orders, was kneeling in front of me, not as a joke, not as a performance, but as a choice. He opened the pouch, and there it was, a ring that caught the candlelight and scattered it across the tablecloth. For a second, all I could think about was the cheap band I had worn years ago, from a man who left before my belly had even started to show. The difference between those two moments felt like the distance between galaxies. He didn't ask with a perfect line. He didn't have to. I heard the question in the way his voice dipped, in the way his hand trembled just enough that I knew this mattered more than any other deal he'd ever made. He was asking if I would take everything he was, the restaurants and the shadows behind them, the legal documents already drawn up, the watchful eyes in the lobby, the way he made pancakes shaped like hearts on Sunday mornings and call it mine. For half a heartbeat, fear raised its head. Fear of his world. Fear of what it meant to tie my daughter's future to a man whose enemies had names and power. Fear of getting it wrong again. Then I looked around. I saw my mother pressing her fingers to the bridge of her nose, trying not to cry. I saw my father's mouth tuck into the smallest proud smile. I saw Emily's eyes shining, Chloe grinning like she had seen this coming miles away, Jenna halfway out of her chair with excitement. I felt Ava's eyes on me, wide and hopeful, silently asking if we could please, finally, make official what her heart already knew. I realized that every time I had needed someone in the past few months, when men showed up at my door in the middle of the night, when my ex tried to corner me, when my cousin's stupidity put a target on my back, Adrian had been there first. He had never asked me to stop being who I was. He had just asked if he could stand in front of me when bullets, literal or metaphorical, started to fly. So I said yes. I felt the word leave my body more than I heard it. It came out on a breath, wrapped in every long shift, Every late-night panic, every moment I had sat alone and convinced myself this kind of life was not for people like me. The room moved after that. People clapped. My mother absolutely cried and pretended she wasn't. Emily flung her arms around me and nearly knocked me into Adrian. Chloe whispered in my ear that it was about time. Staff peered in from the doorway with soft smiles. The band shifted into a song that sounded suspiciously like the one from my sister's wedding, and the whole scene blurred at the edges in the best way. Later, much later, after dessert had been picked at, and congratulations given, and Ava had fallen asleep on a banquette with her head in my lap and one hand still reaching toward the ring on my finger, I stepped out onto the terrace attached to the private room. The city was the same as it had always been. Lights, noise, traffic, a constant hum of lives brushing past each other. The difference was inside me. People like to say that getting engaged feels like a fairy tale. Mine felt more like signing a peace treaty after a long, messy war. It was joyful, yes. My heart felt huge in my chest. But it was also serious, grounded. I was not stepping into a storybook. I was stepping deeper into a life where danger existed, where people had scars and pasts and enemies. The difference now was that I knew exactly what I was choosing. In the weeks that followed, life did not suddenly become simple. There were meetings about security that I never thought I would be part of. There were wedding planning conversations where Chloe and Emily argued about flowers, while Adrian and I quietly discussed guest lists in terms of safety, not just seating charts. There was a moment in his office where he told me he was slowly shifting more of his operations into clean, legitimate channels, not because he wanted to be a saint, but because he wanted to be around to walk Ava down an aisle someday if she wanted that. There were tiny, ordinary moments that meant more to me than any centerpiece ever could. Ava wandering into his study in the morning and crawling into his lap while he was on a call, and him shifting to put it on speaker so he could wrap an arm around her. My father stopped by the penthouse one afternoon with a box of old tools because he had heard we were thinking about fixing something in the guest room, and men like him do not show up like that for people they don't consider family. One night, a few weeks after the proposal, I heard Ava in her room talking to one of her stuffed animals. She said, in this sleepy, matter-of-fact voice, that she had two dads now, one who had given her his eyes and then left, and one who had given her his name and stayed. She decided out loud that the one who stayed was the important one. I stood in the hallway and cried quietly where she couldn't see me. When I look back now, telling you all of this, I see the whole thread laid out. I see the girl sitting alone at the wedding table, trying not to cry in a room full of people who thought she had already failed at life. I see the man in the dark suit who walked toward her, offering a fake role she never expected to want to keep. I see warehouses and hospital corridors and parking garages and long nights on a terrace where the city lights made it easier to admit truths. Mostly, I see a woman who spent a long time believing she was only ever going to be leverage for other people. The mistake. The single mom. The warning story. If you hear anything in all of this, I hope it's this. You are not the weakest link just because someone treated you like the most expendable one. Being left did not make me unlovable. Being broke did not make me unworthy. Being scared did not mean I couldn't stand in a warehouse and tell a dangerous man he didn't get to threaten children in my city. Adrian is not perfect. His hands are not clean. His world is still darker than I sometimes want to admit. But he shows up. He does the work. He uses his power, both the kind that lives in shadows and the kind that lives in courtrooms, to protect instead of destroy. And when he looks at my daughter and me, he doesn't see leverage. He sees family. Letting myself be loved by someone like that did not erase my strength. It shifted it. It taught me that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop standing alone at the back of the room and let someone stand next to you, knowing they will not run at the first sign of trouble. Maybe you've had your own version of that wedding table. Maybe you've been the one seated by the kitchen doors, listening to everyone else laugh while you quietly counted your bills in your head. Maybe you've been made to feel like you were the mistake, the leftover, the cautionary tale. If any part of my story sounds like yours, I hope you'll remember this. The way people treat you is not a measure of your worth. The ones who are meant to stay will prove it with actions, not promises. They will show up when it's hard, not just when it looks good on social media. And if hearing all this made you feel a little less alone, a little more seen, I'd really love to know. You can share your own story in the comments if you're comfortable, or just tell me which moment hit you the hardest. If you want more long, messy, honest love stories like this, you can like this video, share it with someone who needs the reminder, and stick around for the next one. Because somewhere out there, another woman is sitting at another table, convinced this is as good as it gets. And maybe, just maybe, her whole life is about to change with one unexpected offer to dance.